It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and I was sitting in my favorite café hunched over my architecture books. Final exams were approaching, and I wanted to do well. As I took notes in my notebook, a tall, charming young man approached my table.
Excuse me, is this seat taken?
I looked up and met the most captivating brown eyes I had ever seen. "Oh no, please go ahead," I replied, smiling.
Thanks. I'm Pedro, by the way.
"I'm Anna, nice to meet you," I responded, shaking his hand. Pedro pulled out the chair and sat down, placing his own book on the table.
Architecture, huh? Do you study at the Federal University?
So I nodded. "Yes, I'm in my final year. What about you?"
I graduated in civil engineering 2 years ago. Now I'm working at a construction company nearby.
We started talking about our studies and professional aspirations. I was impressed by Pedro's knowledge and passion for sustainable construction. He, in turn, seemed enchanted by my creativity and determination. The hours flew by without us noticing, and soon the cafe was announcing its closing. So Pedro and I gathered our belongings and walked out together.
You know, Anna, I really enjoyed talking to you today. Would you like to meet me at the park tomorrow afternoon? We could go for a walk and talk some more.
My heart raced. "I'd love to," I replied, smiling. We exchanged phone numbers and said our goodbyes, both eager for the next day's date. As I walked home, I couldn't contain the smile on my face. There was something special about Pedro, and I couldn't wait to find out what the future held for us. The next day, I woke up with butterflies in my stomach, excited for my date with Pedro. I carefully chose my outfit, opting for a light floral dress that made me feel beautiful and confident. When I arrived at the park, Pedro was already there, waiting for me with a warm smile.
Hi, Anna. You look beautiful.
We started walking through the park, talking about everything and anything. Pedro made me laugh with his funny stories and impressed me with his intelligence and insight. He was attentive, always listening to me with genuine interest and asking thoughtful questions. The hours flew by as we walked, sat on benches to enjoy the view, and even shared an ice cream. Pedro was a gentleman, always treating me with kindness and respect. I felt special and valued by his side. In the weeks that followed, Pedro and I continued to meet regularly. We went to cafes, watched movies at the cinema, and even had a picnic in the park where we had our first date. Each moment we spent together only reinforced the growing connection between us. Pedro surprised me with small, thoughtful gestures, like bringing me my favorite coffee during a study session or sending me encouraging messages before an important exam. He always seemed to know exactly what I needed and was there to support me. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice a change in my feelings. My heart would race every time I saw Pedro, and I found myself thinking about him constantly. His presence brought a joy and peace that I had never experienced before. It was during a particularly stunning sunset in the park that the realization hit me. We were sitting side by side on a blanket, watching the sky transform into a kaleidoscope of colors. Pedro put his arm around me, pulling me closer, and that's when I knew. I was falling in love with Pedro. The thought filled me with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. I knew Pedro was special, but did he feel the same way about me? As I snuggled into his arms, I decided to enjoy the moment and let the future unfold naturally. After all, no matter what happened, I would always have the precious memories of these moments with Pedro. And who knows, maybe this was just the beginning of something truly magical. I remember one particular Saturday morning when I woke up to the inviting aroma of pancakes and fresh coffee. Intrigued, I went to the kitchen and found Pedro, wearing the apron I had given him as a gift on our last anniversary, busy preparing an elaborate breakfast. He came over to hug me and gave me a soft kiss with a warm smile.
Good morning, love. I thought you might like a surprise today.
My heart swelled with love and gratitude as we sat down to share the meal. laughing and talking about our plans for the weekend. It was in moments like these that I felt the depth of our connection, the feeling of having found a true partner in life. In the following weeks, Pedro continued to be the perfect boyfriend. He surprised me with flowers, took me on romantic dinners, and always had sweet words to say to me. I felt on cloud 9, increasingly captivated by his charm and attention. However, subtly, things began to change. Pedro started taking longer to respond to my messages. Sometimes I would wait hours for a reply, only to receive a brief excuse about how he was busy with work. When I invited him out, Pedro would often say he already had other commitments.
Sorry, Anna, but I already made plans to meet some friends tonight.
He would say. Or sometimes,
I have to work late on the project. We can't see each other tonight. Sorry.
Then came the hardest blow. Pedro called me on Friday night saying a last-minute work trip had come up and he would be away for the entire weekend. I had planned a special surprise for the two of us, but now all my plans were ruined. I spent the weekend feeling anxious and insecure. Was Pedro losing interest in me? Was there someone else? My mind wandered through increasingly gloomy scenarios. On Monday, however, Pedro reappeared as if nothing had happened. He invited me to dinner at his apartment and spent the night showering me with affection and compliments. We ended up giving in to passion, making love until the early hours of the morning. I fell asleep in Pedro's arms, feeling safe and loved. But in the morning, I woke up alone, with only a note on the bedside table.
Had to leave early for a meeting. I'll call you later. Kisses. Pedro.
Later turned into 2 whole days without any news. I obsessively checked my phone, waiting for a message or a call that never came. When I finally heard from Pedro, it was just a short, cold message saying he was busy and would call me when he could. My heart was tight, confused by the ambiguous signals Pedro was sending. One moment, he was attentive and passionate. The next, distant and evasive. Had I done something wrong? Was I not enough for Pedro? These questions haunted me as I tried to understand what was happening between us. I knew I needed to have a serious conversation with Pedro to clarify where we were and where we were going, but a part of me was afraid of the truth, afraid to find out that maybe our love wasn't as strong as I thought. With a heavy heart and a mind full of doubts, I prepared to face Pedro and discover the fate of our relationship. Would this be the end of our love, or just an obstacle to be overcome? Only time would tell. In the following weeks, the situation with Pedro only got worse. He continued to give me excuses and postpone our dates, always with a different justification.
Sorry, Anna, but I need to work late today. My mom isn't feeling well. I have to go visit her.
I tried to be understanding, telling myself that Pedro was just going through a difficult time. After all, we all have our responsibilities and problems, right? I didn't want to seem demanding or insensitive, but the truth was, I was feeling increasingly neglected and confused. When we did manage to meet, Pedro seemed distant and preoccupied. He no longer looked me in the eyes like before, and our moments of intimacy became scarce and rushed. I refused to believe that Pedro could be losing interest in me. After all, we had had such incredible moments together, shared so many dreams and plans for the future. He couldn't just throw it all away, could he? So, one day, I decided to surprise Pedro. I prepared a romantic dinner at my apartment with candles, soft music, and his favorite dish. I wanted to show him how much I cared, how much I was willing to fight for our love. But Pedro never showed up. I sat at the table for hours, waiting until I finally received a message from him.
Sorry, Anna, I won't be able to make it. Something came up at work. I'll talk to you later.
I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. How could Pedro do this to me? How could he leave me waiting without even calling me to explain properly? But even so, I refused to face the truth. I made excuses for Pedro, telling myself that he was just stressed, that everything would soon return to normal. I clung to every crumb of attention he gave me, every affectionate message, every empty promise. My friends tried to warn me, saying that I deserved someone who valued and respected me, but I didn't want to listen. I was blinded by the love I felt for Pedro, unable to see what was right in front of my eyes. I lost myself in memories of the happy moments we had shared, of the plans we had made. I convinced myself that all of this couldn't have been in vain, that our love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. But deep down, I knew I was fooling myself. I knew that Pedro was pulling away from me, that his interest was diminishing with each passing day. I just didn't want to admit it to myself, because admitting it would mean facing the pain of rejection and abandonment. And so, I continued in this cycle of denial and confusion, waiting for a miracle that could save our relationship, waiting for Pedro to become the man I had fallen in love with again, the man who had promised to love me forever. As the weeks dragged on, it became increasingly difficult for me to deny the reality of my relationship with Pedro. His disappearances became more frequent, his excuses more hollow, and his messages more scarce. I found myself trapped in a cycle of anxiety and despair, obsessively checking my phone for any sign of Pedro. Every time my phone beeped, my heart would race, only to shatter again when I saw it wasn't him. I tried to convince myself that everything would be okay, that Pedro still loved me, and that we were just going through a rough patch. I clung to every crumb of attention he gave me, every affectionate message, every empty promise. Then, one day, I decided to confront Pedro. I couldn't take it anymore, living in this constant uncertainty and anguish. I needed to know what was happening, needed to hear from him that there was still hope for us. I arranged to meet Pedro at a café near my work. When he arrived, I could see in his eyes that something had changed. He seemed distant, uncomfortable, as if he wanted to be anywhere but there with me. "Pedro, we need to talk," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can't take this situation anymore. You're avoiding me, giving me excuses. What's happening with us?" Pedro sighed, taking my hands in his.
Anna, I know I've been distant lately. Work has been crazy, and I've been dealing with some family issues. But I want you to know that I still love you. You're the most important person in my life.
I felt my heart fill with hope. It was everything I wanted to hear, everything I needed to believe that we still had a chance. "I love you too, Pedro. I miss you so much. I want things to go back to the way they were before."
I know, love, and they will. I promise I'll try harder, though I'll be more present. You're my world, Anna. I don't want to lose you.
And with those words, I allowed myself to believe again, to believe that our love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, that Pedro and I still had a future together. We hugged, and for a moment, everything seemed right again. I clung to Pedro, clung to that moment of reconnection, of renewed hope. But deep down, a part of me knew that something was still wrong, that Pedro's words, as sweet as they were, didn't erase his recent actions, that empty promises weren't enough to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. Still, I chose to believe. I chose to cling to that fragile hope because the alternative, facing the possibility that our love had come to an end, was simply too painful to bear. And so, I allowed myself to be convinced by Pedro's words, allowed myself to be enveloped by his promises and declarations of love. I knew I was deluding myself, but at that moment, the illusion was all I had. What I didn't know was how much longer this illusion would last, and how painful the fall would be when the truth finally came to light. After our meeting at the café, things seemed to improve for a while. Pedro was more attentive, more present. He sent me affectionate messages throughout the day, called me at night to talk about how our day had been. It was as if we had gone back in time, to those first months of dating, when everything was perfect. I clung to this change, to this new phase of our relationship. I wanted to believe that we had overcome our difficulties, that we had come out stronger on the other side. I allowed myself to dream again about our future together, about all the plans we had made. Despite the challenges we were facing, there were still moments of tenderness and complicity that gave me hope. One of those moments happened during a walk in the park on a lazy Sunday afternoon. As we strolled hand in hand along the shaded trails, Pedro suddenly pulled me into a spontaneous hug and whispered in my ear,
I know I haven't been the best boyfriend lately, but I want you to know how much you mean to me. You're my world, Anna.
I looked into his eyes and saw a sincerity that had been absent for a long time. At that instant, I felt a spark of the connection that had united us in the first place, a reminder of the love we had shared. We spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the park, laughing like children as we fed the ducks in the lake and raced each other on the grass. For a few blessed hours, it was as if we had rediscovered the lighter, more carefree version of ourselves, the version that knew how to find joy in simple things. In the days that followed, I felt a renewed energy and purpose. I dove into my architecture studies with a fervor I hadn't felt in a long time, finding delight in the small triumphs of a well-executed project or a compliment from a professor. I also began reconnecting with friends I had neglected during the most intense period of my relationship with Pedro. Scheduling meetups for coffee and dinners, their laughter and stories reminded me that there was a whole world beyond my romantic bubble, and that I had much to offer as a friend and confidant. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, things began to change again. Pedro's messages became less frequent, his calls shorter and more hurried. He started canceling our dates at the last minute, always with a different excuse: work, family, commitments I didn't know he had. I tried not to let it shake me, tried to convince myself that it was just a passing phase, that Pedro still loved me and was trying to keep his promises. But as the weeks went by, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the truth. Pedro was pulling away from me again. His words at the cafe, his promises to change and be more present, had been just that. Words. Empty words, spoken in the heat of the moment to appease me, to make me believe that everything would be okay. I felt my heart break a little more each day, with each unanswered message, each canceled date. I wanted to confront Pedro again, demand explanations, but a part of me was afraid of what he might say, afraid to hear that he didn't love me anymore, that he wanted to end everything. So I clung to my illusion, to the increasingly fragile hope that things would get better. I convinced myself that Pedro was just going through a rough patch, that he would go back to being the loving, attentive boyfriend I knew. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I knew I was allowing myself to be deceived, deluded by false promises and empty declarations of love. I knew I was postponing the inevitable, prolonging my own pain and suffering, and yet I couldn't bring myself to face the truth. I couldn't muster the courage to put an end to that relationship that had become a shadow of what it once was. Because admitting it was over, that Pedro didn't love me anymore, would be like admitting my own failure. It would be like admitting that I wasn't enough, that I didn't deserve to be loved and valued. So I continued in that vicious cycle, clinging to crumbs of attention, deluding myself with false hopes. I knew I was hurting myself, that each day in that situation was like a stab to my already wounded heart. But the alternative, facing life without Pedro, facing the possibility of never being loved again, seemed even more frightening. And so I allowed myself to sink deeper and deeper into that illusion, into that fantasy of a love that no longer existed. I allowed myself to be consumed by pain and denial, unable to see a way out, unable to imagine a life beyond that toxic relationship. What I didn't know was that life had other plans for me, that the pain I was feeling was just the beginning of a much larger journey. A journey of self-discovery, healing and rebuilding. A journey that would take me to places I had never imagined and transform me in ways I never thought possible. But at that moment, all I felt was the pain of a broken heart and the anguish of broken promises, and all I could do was cling to my illusion, hoping that somehow, some way, things could go back to the way they were before. I woke up with the morning sun seeping through the curtains, but instead of bringing me warmth, it only illuminated the emptiness beside me in bed. Pedro had left early again, without saying goodbye. I used to wonder where he went, what he did, but now I just felt numb. I went to the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman looking back at me? Her eyes, once bright with love and hope, now seemed dull and tired. When had I lost myself so much? As the days went by, I began to notice things I would have previously ignored or rationalized. The way Pedro brushed off my attempts at conversation with monosyllabic responses. How he always had time for his friends and hobbies, but never for me. Small neglects and disappointments that piled up like stones on my shoulders. I tried to talk to him, to share my feelings, but he always deflected or accused me of being too sensitive.
You're imagining things, Anna. I love you. You know that.
But his words rang hollow, devoid of the tenderness they once held. I wanted to believe him, to cling to the illusion that everything would be okay. But a quiet voice inside me, one I had silenced for so long, began to whisper the truth I feared to face. I started writing in a journal, pouring my most intimate thoughts and emotions onto the pages. With each word, I felt like I was releasing some of the weight I carried. I reread my earlier entries, tracing the gradual decline of our relationship, and I could no longer deny what was staring me in the face. I cried myself to sleep that night, mourning not just what I had lost, but the woman I had left behind in the process. I knew I couldn't go on like this, suffocating in a relationship that was draining the life out of me. But the thought of leaving Pedro, of facing life without him, was paralyzing. He had been my safe harbor for so long, even if now he felt more like an anchor dragging me down. How could I find the strength to break free? I fell asleep with these questions swirling in my mind, my pillow damp with tears. I didn't have the answers yet, but at least I was starting to ask the right questions. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step towards reclaiming myself. In the days that followed, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me longed to confront Pedro, to demand answers for his distant and indifferent behavior. But another part, that insidious voice of doubt, made me question my own perceptions. Maybe I was overreacting, reading too much into his actions. Maybe the stress of work was consuming him, and I was being selfish to expect more of his attention. After all, he was still with me, wasn't he? That had to mean something. So, I decided to test a theory. I stopped reaching out to Pedro, stopped trying to initiate conversations or plan moments together. Instead, I focused on my own routine. Work, chores, hobbies I had neglected. I wanted to see if he would notice my absence, if he would make an effort to reach out to me. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. Pedro continued with his usual patterns, coming home late, immersed in his own world. But as days turned into weeks, the silence between us grew, an ever-widening chasm that neither of us seemed willing to bridge. I wondered if this was a sign, a confirmation that my suspicions were correct. Or maybe it was just a temporary phase, a natural ebb in a long-term relationship. I clung to every scrap of affection, every rare moment of connection, like a drowning person clinging to a piece of driftwood. But even as I struggled to keep up appearances, I felt my resentment growing. I hated the feeling of always waiting, always hoping for a sign that I still mattered to him. I hated the way I had become a spectator in my own relationship, watching and waiting for crumbs of attention. I poured myself into my journal, spilling my darkest thoughts and deepest desires onto the pages. I wrote about the loneliness I felt, even when Pedro was sitting right next to me, about the fear that maybe our love wasn't strong enough to withstand the erosion of time and neglect. But I also wrote about the glimpses of joy and peace I felt when I was alone, lost in the pages of a book. They were fleeting moments, but they gave me hope that maybe there was a life for me beyond this relationship, a life where I could rediscover and value myself again. I wasn't ready to give up yet, to admit that maybe we had lost ourselves beyond rescue. But as I navigated the waves of doubt and uncertainty, I could feel a shift forming within me, a growing awareness that I deserved more than to be a mere afterthought in someone else's eyes. Sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the cup of coffee cooling in front of me, I felt a crushing weight in my chest. It had been weeks since I had started my experiment, since I had stopped reaching out to Pedro, waiting to see if he would come to me. And yet, here we were, living parallel lives that rarely intersected. I knew what I needed to do. The truth was there, hammering at the back of my mind, demanding to be acknowledged. But still, I hesitated, clinging to the tattered shreds of what had once been a vibrant, passionate love. How had we gotten to this point? I wondered, sifting through memories in my mind like the pages of a faded scrapbook. There had been no decisive moment, no explosive betrayal or fight that had shattered our relationship. Instead, it was a series of small neglects, of silences that stretched on too long, of broken promises and unmet expectations. And now here I was, facing the prospect of ending it all, not with a bang but with a whimper, not with the fiery certainty of righteous anger, but with the resigned sadness of a dream, dying. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over Pedro's name in my contact list. How many times had I made this same call, filled with hope and anticipation? But now, all I felt was a sense of dread, a suffocating fear that I was making a terrible mistake. I took a deep breath and hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice, before Pedro answered with a distracted hello. "Hi, it's me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you have a minute? We need to talk." There was a pause, followed by a sigh.
Sure, what's wrong?
I closed my eyes, gathering every ounce of courage I could muster. "I think we should break up. I don't think this is working anymore." The words came out in a rush, tumbling out before I lost my nerve. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for one horrible moment I thought Pedro had hung up. But then he spoke, his voice tight with restrained emotion.
Are you sure? I mean, I know things have been tough, but I don't want to give up on us.
I felt tears stinging my eyes, and I swallowed hard against the lump in my throat. "I don't either, but I don't think we can keep going like this. We both deserve more than this." We talked for a few more minutes, exchanging hesitant assurances that we still cared about each other, that this wasn't the end of everything. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a sense of finality settling in. Something had irrevocably changed between us, and there was no going back. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring out the window without really seeing anything. I knew I had done the right thing, the only thing I could have done. But it didn't make the pain any less real, the sense of loss any less acute. I knew there would be difficult days ahead, moments when I would question my decision and long for the comforting familiarity of what I had left behind. But I also knew that I could no longer settle for half measures, for a love that diminished me rather than uplifted me, So I wiped my tears and stood up, determined to face whatever came next with my head held high. I had taken the first step on an unknown path, and though I had no idea where it would lead me, I knew it was a path I needed to walk. Not for anyone else, but for myself.
Hey there, Unraveling Ties family. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. I hope it touched your heart, made you think, or even inspired you in some way. We would love to hear your thoughts and feelings about this story. Don't be shy. Leave a comment below and share your perspective with our community. Your voice matters to us. If you enjoyed today's story and want to be a part of our journey as we unravel the complexities of human relationships, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a new story. We're always eager to explore new angles and dive into the themes that resonate with you the most. So tell us, what kind of stories would you like to see in upcoming episodes? Your input helps us create content that you'll love. And hey, if today's story reminded you of a personal experience or a tale you'd like to share, we're all ears. Feel free to share your own stories in the comments. Who knows, your story might even inspire a future Unraveling Ties episode. Once again, thank you for being a part of the Unraveling Ties family. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Until next time, keep embracing the ties that bind us and never stop exploring the depths of the human heart. See you in the next video.